Hi, I'm Chip, and if you have a dryer that you've recently changed the belt on and it's broken again, chances are it's not the cheap belt that you bought. It's probably some other component inside your dryer. So let's go up to the studio and I'll try to explain what's going on. I'll see you there. So the other day a friend of mine calls me up and he says, "Hey Chip, you know that dryer of mine, it isn't tumbling to close again." I'd put a new belt on that same dryer just a few months back, and it seems it had either come off or broken. So when I questioned him about it, he said he thought it was because his missus was overloading the dryer. So I went with that and I waited for him to bring it to the shop. So it was another one of those rainy days, and I had several repairs going that they needed to be finished that afternoon. So when he got there, sure enough, the belt was in a pile at the bottom of the drum, and it was broken. And it was a Whirlpool dryer, so I got a 341, 241 belt off the parts rack. I didn't even bother removing the drum because I already cleaned the cabinet the last time he was there. And I slipped a new belt over the drum, and I fed it through the idler pulley yoke, and I fitted it over the little motor pulley. And once I had the front back on, I plugged it in, I pushed the start button, and I watched as a new belt found its track on the drum. It worked fine. So I pushed the top down until the clip snapped into place, and I replaced the lint filter slot screws and put the filter back in. I let the machine run for about 5 minutes and before I turned it off, and I gathered up the power cord on the back and I zip tied it so that it'd be easier to transport. Well, my customer, and he's a good friend, his name's Gary, he returned later and we loaded it up and off he went, and I just chalked it up as another successful job. I was just finishing up the last job of the day when the phone rings, and it's Gary again. He says, "Chip, this dryer isn't turning." Well, now I'm kind of puzzled, and I question him, and he says it'll turn without the clothes in it, but when you put the clothes in it, it wouldn't turn. So I'm thinking the belt slipped off, or the drive pulling, it may be riding on the motor shaft. And I tell him not to worry, I'm going to close up early and I'm going to come to his house and I'm going to fix it. So now Gary and I, we're pretty good friends, and we worked together at the Office of Forestry for the state of Louisiana for a lot of years before we both retired. And he's a firefighter and I was an aircraft pilot. So now one of the perks of being an aircraft pilot with Office of Forestry is that you have the opportunity to go out on these western fires through our state's cooperation with the National Interagency Fire Center. So all you have to do is qualify, do the physical qualifications, and if we don't have any fires going on in the state of Louisiana, they let the pilots go too. So Gary and I had worked together on several of these western fires, and you can see me here somewhere in Idaho on a fire that we worked together. Oh, but I digress. Anyway, we had a great time, worked several different states, and we met folks from all over the United States and Canada. It was a great experience. Anyway, when I get to Gary's house, and I removed about 15 pounds of clothes from the tub, so I hit the start button and the tub starts to spin normally, but when we load it, the drum starts to slow down, it turns real slow, and eventually it stops turning altogether. So I disassembled the dryer, I found that the belt's intact and still on the pulley, but when I examined the pulley, like I should have done to begin with, there's absolutely no grooves left in it. So that belt was just kind of slipping on metal when the tub was loaded. Now, if you look at the science of a dryer belt engineering, you can figure out pretty fast that when the grooves of either the belt or the pulley are missing, this is going to cause you a big problem. So this diagram here shows you how a new belt and pulleys are supposed to work. A typical Whirlpool dryer belt can't be more than about 1/4 inch wide, but it's able to drive a large drum full of wet clothes, and here's why. Those V-belt grooves in the belt effectively increase the surface area, so that instead of only having a 1/4 inch of contact, the pulley there is about 3 times that surface area, and consequently the 3 times the friction to drive that large drum. So if the pulley or the belt is missing these grooves, like in this diagram, that shows how these components wear over time. Then the effectiveness of the motor driven belt gets diminished. Anyway, so I examined this belt and I found that it hadn't been damaged, so I got another dry pulley from the service truck and I replaced that, and he paid me for the new pulley. And then we sat on his back porch and we drank coffee and reminisced about our days fighting forest fires together. It was a blast. So now in my experience, I've found several things that will cause strain and wear on a dryer's drive belt, and that worn out motor pulley isn't the only one. So when you have a dryer that you've taken apart, one of the things you should always check are the drum rollers. So a telltale sign that something's going on with the drum roller is a thumping noise as the drum turns. If you hear this, the chances are that one of those rollers has seized up just long enough to wear a flat spot on it, and that makes a thump each time it makes a revolution. So in this case, you should take a small pick, remove the triangle clip from the roller axle, and work that roller off and replace it. The most common reason these rollers stop turning is a buildup of hair on the axles. Now, this wad of hair will eventually slow and stop the roller from turning. And once you remove a roller, there's usually another triangle clip on the back side of that shaft that sits in a groove, and you should take it off and then clean all the hair and whatnot from off that shaft. And after you clean the shafts, you want to reinstall the rollers and replace them. They should turn easy on their shafts without any resistance if you fix them correctly. So if the roller won't spin freely, you may have to replace the axle, which is a pain. And I usually use the old shafts on old axles because they're rarely damaged. And on the Whirlpool style machines, you need to examine the felt seals on the front panel of the door section. It's where the tub touches the door section of the cabinet. And you want to be sure that they're keeping the drum lip from contacting any metal or plastic parts on the frame, because that'll cause a drag that wears this belt out. If all these things are corrected, and then your belt should last for a long time. Okay, on GE machines, instead of rollers, your dryer tub may be supported by a ball and cradle, or it has a hard plastic cylindrical bushing that fits into a hole on the back side of the cabinet. And you need to make sure these are intact and they function properly. And on the ball and cradle configuration, you might put a dab of high temperature grease into the Teflon cradle where the ball sits. And you want to be sure it's high temperature because that sits right over the top of the element. You don't want the grease to heat up and drip on that element, maybe cause a fire. So on the front of the GE drum, the tub lip usually rides on a Teflon glides that fit on the top of a plastic frame, and below that's a felt seal that should also be examined for wear. And you can see here the problem this poor guy had with his glides. They're wore out pretty much. So it's normal for these to wear out, and they should be replaced as needed, and perhaps once a year for a family of 4, and maybe every 2 years for a couple. And the key to fixing a dryer that breaks belts is to mitigate the strain on that drive system. And I may also say here, you have to install the new belt correctly. I'm planning a future video on how to route the belts on their idler pulleys and their drive shafts for most of the common dryers that we have today. So if you mistakenly install a belt upside down, the grooves on that drive pulley are going to cut your new belt in about 4 or 5 strips real fast. And I know this on account of I did it once, and Mr. Harper, that was his great amusement for the day. He chuckled about that for a long time. Now, if you install a belt and it's caught between an idler pulley and the metal arm that it's mounted on, then the friction of the drive pulley that's on the motor on that belt that can't move, it's going to burn it in two, like in this picture. Now, if you're a service technician, or you may be a do-it-yourselfer and you want to know some more interesting trade secrets, then let me direct you to my chubby little team members that are right over there pointing out something that you should watch next.